Good morning. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious Heavenly Father, in your abbot, Kevin, you give an example, the gospel lived to perfection. Help us to follow him by keeping before us the things of heaven amid all the changes of this world. Grant this through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. All right, that prayer was the prayer offered on the feast day of St. Kevin of Glendalough, another Irish saint that we're going to touch a little bit on today. This is our final session. I realize now that I could probably run this for another couple months and still have something to talk about, but the idea was this was going to get us through the summer, and I was going to share, it was going to be an easy class, and I just shared pictures that I liked with you. And it's been that and a whole lot more, so I've really enjoyed being able to share with you those the own pilgrimages I've had, my own pilgrimages, but also to talk with you about what Celtic Christianity is and what it has been and what it's becoming. And we're going to talk a little, we're going to wrap things up today with a few more photos of some important places in the history of Celtic Christianity. And then we're going to finish up with some discussions about why Celtic Christianity has become so meaningful to a lot of us here in our own time, and what it is about Celtic Christianity, where the history meets the ideas we have about it and keeps it alive and growing. That's what our discussion is going to be about. And if you didn't understand what I said, maybe I'll figure it out by the time we get to the end of it, you'll know. That's where we are. And we finished up our discussion on Skellig Michael, which was the early part of what we think of as Celtic Christianity. And we're going to touch on a few of those things today. But today's class is going to be about the Celtic Church then and now, which is pretty much what we've been talking about the whole time. But I want to look at a few more important pieces of Celtic Christianity from its history, and then jump into where I think it meets with things that are important to us as Christians today. And I want to hear from you about some of the things you think about it. This is a wonderful image from inside Muckross Abbey, just south of Killarney. And I'm going to show this to you again later in the class and tell you why I think this beautiful ancient yew tree growing in the middle of a monastic cloister really, to me, is a symbol of Celtic Christianity, both of the past and of the present. I thought I'd start out today with a couple of things that we looked at back in the second class we had, which are pivotal moments really in the history of Celtic Christianity. What we really know about the ancient Celtic Church. When I say ancient Celtic Church, I'm not talking about the ancient Celts, because that goes well beyond the Christian period into a time beyond that. But Celtic Christianity, I think, continues to carry some of that with it, which is what gives it that identity. But these are pivotal moments of Celtic Christianity after Christianity begins to become a religion of Western Europe. Last week I had a map that I showed you, and I didn't put that on this week, so I apologize. But it was a really good map that showed you the movement of Christianity from the Holy Land, but also from Egypt, which is where monasticism begins, and how it spreads into Western Europe. Around the year 325, Constantine declares that Christianity is the religion of the Roman Empire and expands tremendously after that. But still, there are portions of Europe that are not Christian, and there are portions of what we think of as Celtic communities, England, Scotland, Ireland, that are still on the borderline between the two. So that's what we talked about. So these pivotal moments are how Celtic Christianity is spreading and the important people that are in it. And of course, all these important people I mentioned are the old guys. There were a lot of women that were important in this too, like St. Bridget. But St. Bridget is so ancient, we really don't know the history of where the boundaries cross between St. Bridget, the Christian nun or member of a Christian monastic community in Ireland, and where the Celtic paganism interconnects with Bridget. So the people I have on this important list of moments are the ones you'd expect. Saint Patrick, or Padraig as it's in the Irish language, who comes into Ireland in the 5th century, in the mid-400s, and brings the Christian faith from Roman Britain, right, from the Roman section that is controlling England into Ireland, and makes Ireland really the first fully Christian Celtic country. Because once the Romans pull out of England, then Christianity goes out with them as well for the most part. That's why the next important person is St. Columba, Columcille in the Irish language. And St. Columba moves out of Ireland and comes back across into the north part of Scotland. He stops on the Isle of Iona, which for any of you who've ever thought about a Celtic pilgrimage, more than likely the Isle of Iona has been on that list. Getting to the Isle of Iona is not easy. It's not as easy as flying into London or Edinburgh. You have to get on a train and go to Oban, and then you've got to get on a boat and ride it to the Isle of Mull, and then you got to get on a bus on the Isle of Mull and take it across and get on another ferry that will take you to the Isle of Iona. So that's a tricky trip to get out there. So if anybody made that trip to the Isle of Iona, there you go. You know what I'm talking about, right? Not the easiest way to get there. I made it there as well and had a wonderful time visiting where St. Columba was. But really, that's where Christianity comes back into what we now refer to as the British Isles, which doesn't include Ireland. It includes Northern Ireland now, but is really England, Scotland, and Wales. And it's St. Columba, as we talked about, who moves down, sets up a monastery, and then sends out our next, well, I forgot to add this one. That's right. 597 is when St. Columba dies and St. Augustine from Canterbury arrives. Why is that a pivotal moment in Celtic Christianity? Because St. Augustine is sent up by Pope Gregory to bring the Roman Catholic Church back into England that's beginning to Christianize amongst the Anglo-Saxons who took it over once the Romans were out. And so St. Columba is up in the north at Iona. He dies at the same time that St. Augustine comes in. And St. Columba sends his people out from Iona to move into Scotland, the low country of Scotland in the south, and into Northumbria in the north of England near York. And his great saint that we remember is St. Aidan, who brings the faith from Iona, along with Cuthbert, who will be another important saint of that northern part of England. And they will establish what we will think of as the Celtic Christian Church. And remember, we talked several weeks back about the important differences between the Celtic Church and the Roman Church. Was it because the Celtics really enjoyed nature, or because they were really supportive of women more than the Roman Church was? No. It had a lot to do with the way the monks cut their hair, and it had everything to do with when they celebrated Easter. Two important pieces of the real historic difference between the Celtic Christian Church and the Roman Church. And how is this all settled? Well, the guys can't figure it out, so we finally have our first saint, and I was so pathetic I didn't write her name down here, so I do apologize. St. Hilda of Whitby is one of the most important pivotal pieces of the Celtic tradition, because she calls a synod together and says, all right guys, if you can't figure out how to cut your hair, I'm going to pull you together, you're going to figure this out. And that is St. Hilda in the picture here. So it is not the Blessed Virgin Mary as it might look like. That's St. Hilda of Whitby, and she calls the synod and she says we must settle this. And the Roman Catholic Church, which is where the Celtic Church originated from at the time of Patrick, realizes that it should get in line with Pope Gregory and the rest of Western Europe. And so they agree to change their time to when they decide when Easter will be, to the time the Roman Church is. And anybody know when that is? How do you figure out Easter every year? It is the first full moon after the spring equinox. That's exactly right. So you think, man, that sounds very pagan, right? But that's also how the Passover is sorted out. So Passover is that full moon of Passover. After that is when Easter comes to be. And that's why, for Christians, it's very frustrating that we have to constantly have changes in the time of Easter. this year or next year, 2024, get ready, get excited. Valentine's Day and Ash Wednesday are on the same day. So get ready. Wear your black ashes when you go out with your spouse or your significant other, because you get hearts and ashes on Valentine's Day. And why is that? Black roses, exactly. Who knows? Just wanted to warn you. But it all comes because of that full moon after the spring equinox. And that's what makes the difference in the Celtic church and the Roman church. After that, there is a continued influence. Just like in every situation, when somebody makes the decision to change something, that does not mean that everybody's going to agree with it. So at least into the 800s, the 900s, you still have Celtic Christians following their traditions. Their monks shaving their heads the same way. I should have brought that picture back in. Remember, there was the round, bowl head shave that you expect from a monk. And then there was the strange guess about how the Celtic monks shaved their head, which was like a V going down to the ear coming up. So, these are important decisions that they were talking about back then. But the Celtic influence continues. And this is where I think we cross over from history into the traditions of the Celts. The church in Ireland and in Wales and Scotland will hold on to these Celtic traditions all the way across the ages. And when we get to the 19th century, then we have a major Celtic revival. I mean, the Romantic period has come and gone. We're moving into the 19th century. And in the early 19th century, you have a movement in our own Church of England, the Anglican Church, that says, hey, we were really Catholics before the Catholics were. We had our own English Catholic Church. And how did they make that argument? They made it based on the Celts. But they used that argument to bring back Catholic liturgy practices, right? So if you were to go, anybody been, of course I love when I bring stuff up and I didn't do my research to get the names right, but anybody been to Williamsburg in Virginia? And have any of you been to, what's the old Anglican church there? One of the earliest ones that comes in. I can't remember the name of it. Bruton's Parish. That's it, yeah. You go into Bruton's Parish, and if you look at the design of that church, does it look anything like St. Thomas? I mean, I haven't been there, but if the historical setup of it is more of an Anglican tradition that did morning prayer more often than they did Holy Communion. Often in our churches at the time of the American Revolution, you could see this too if you went to St. Paul's Chapel, which is connected to Trinity Wall Street down in the south of New York, where I went to seminary. The setup was the pulpit was way up in the air. And then below the pulpit was a separate area for everybody who was reading the Scripture to go up and to read the Scripture. And down at the very bottom was a tiny little table. And that tiny little table is where you would have Holy Communion once a month at most. So it kind of reminded me of my Baptist background. We only had Holy Communion once a quarter, and it was little white Tic Tacs and some grape juice, right? I mean, it was more of a remembrance. Had nothing to do with the Catholic idea of Holy Communion as we have it today. How does the Protestant Anglican Church bring back in Holy Communion? It does it by the Oxford movement, which has good, solid arguments. Remember, we're all Anglicans and Episcopalians, and the English like a good argument to be solid and rational. So the argument to allow the Church of England to bring back in candles on altars, woo, that was tricky back in the 19th century. Those candles on altars looked too Catholic, and the English were still not happy with getting too Catholic in their Church of England. But the argument that the Oxford movement made was there was a tradition here before Rome came in, and it was the Celtic Church. And the Celtic Church, they kind of didn't want to tell anybody this, practiced Roman Catholic things. But it was Celtic things they did, not Roman Catholic things. So that's the argument that was made to allow us to bring Holy Communion back into the center. And so from the mid-19th century all the way up to the 1979 prayer book, the greatest prayer book of all time, by the way. I will stand by it for eternity. I'm going to start the Society for the Preservation of the 1979 prayer book now. I get a magazine from the people who still support the 28 prayer book. But the reason why the 79 prayer book makes Holy Eucharist the center of what we do is because of this sense that we could still be Protestant and bring a little bit more Catholic back in because we had the Celts to back us up. So that whole long-winded story was to say that the background for that, if you read the 39 articles in your historical documents section of the prayer book, you will read that in some sections it'll use the word, the Romish practice of doing these things is wrong. And then John Henry Newman, who will end up joining the Catholic Church and becoming a saint, he will say, well, that's the Romish things. We're not going to do the Romish things. We're going to do the historic English Celtic way of doing this. And that was enough to win the argument. So my point of telling you that whole story is to say the Celtic idea comes in the 19th century and gets even bigger. W.B. Yeats will write loads of poetry because he's digging into the roots of Ireland. He does, Yeats wasn't really that religious of a person with the church. He was with more esoteric types of things. But that Celtic idea will come into Ireland and lead to the Irish Revolution that will finally give independence to Ireland in the early 20th century. The Celtic idea will be important and will be influential. And it'll also begin to be reshaped. So it's not exactly the history we've been talking about. It's more about the ideas of what Celts were like, which again, it's easy to talk about that when we don't have much written history about it before the church comes into play. So, long-winded story. I want to show you a couple of pieces of what I think show the Celtic tradition holding on in Ireland well after the Synod of Whitby, well after the decision to get back into run with Rome. And you see that in a couple of places out of the mid to late Middle Ages in Ireland. And the places I've been to include Monaster Boyce. Anybody been to Monaster Boyce before in Ireland? An important place to go see some of the most exquisite and the most well-preserved Celtic crosses in all of Western Europe. This is one of the sculptures that the Irish show as their great work of art to contribute to the medieval period of sculptures in Western Europe. It's a gorgeous cross that dates back to the 10th century, maybe the 9th century, they're not for sure. It's called, I knew, where's my wife? She's running away from me. It's Muir's High Cross. We'll just go with that. Actually, it looks like Murdoch's High Cross, but the way you pronounce it is a little different than that. Let's go with Murdoch's High Cross. Murdoch was an abbot at the monastery of Monaster Boyce, which means the monastery of St. Boyce. And this cross is dedicated to him. We know that from some Irish inscription at the very bottom that's still preserved. So we know it comes from the 9th to 10th century, which if you remember my discussion of Skellig Michael, the monastery is still in place there. The idea of the Celtic Christian tradition of getting out, getting away, and living out to be a green martyr, remember that, was still at play. But monasteries are beginning to become the center of whole Irish communities. And Monaster Boyce was one of them. And it has one of the most amazing crosses. If you can get a view of this, and I've got some easier ways to see it, though I love how nice our screen is, you can see it well. This is really the Celtic Irish way of what will be used in stained glass windows, right? So the Celtic crosses with the rings around them, combining, bringing everything together, always has images that tell biblical stories on them. This is a nice slide that will show you all the different stories that are there. It's hard to know and see them when you see it because they're all carved in stone, but you have everything on the east face. You always have an image of the end times. So you have an image of Christ and His majesty in the center. You have those coming to Christ, right? Those are the good people. And the ones being sent away, those are the bad souls. So there's always the judgment happening there. And right below is St. Michael weighing out the souls. So I love this idea. It's a very sensible one, right? The souls come in, they meet with their Lord. St. Michael weighs them to see which soul weighs the right way. The Egyptians did that too, long before the Christians did. And then some of the souls stay and go with the Lord, and some of them are sent away to the place that you know all about. That's the east facing as the sun would come up. So these were always, just like our church, faced in the east and the west direction. And then you have all these other stories. There's the Magi. Moses striking the rock, scenes of David, Cain and Abel. I've got a close-up. I'm going to show you that one. It's really neat. Same thing on the west face. The west face focuses on the crucifixion. So usually those are the two images. The west face also has, for us who love cats, and I have two of them, it's the cats that have the inscription down on the bottom. This has nothing to do with college football, though cats are good. If you're from Kentucky, just leave it at that. So I'd say nothing more than that, and that's what it looks like. Here's a nice close-up image of the east face of Murdoch's high cross. You can see how well it's carved in. There are also loads of images that I've got some closer-up shots of that you can still see what really defines Celtic artwork, which is Celtic knots, right? The images of all these beautiful things intertwined together, which again will bring us to that sense of what Celtic spirituality and Christianity is all about. This is down on the bottom of the east face. I love this. This is, who are these two people with somebody giving somebody an apple? Adam and Eve, right? And this is Cain and Abel. I always feel like Cain gets a bad rap, but that's because my last name is his name. So, the tree of life is here. I mean, it's an amazing image all the way down. Can you imagine what it looked like when it was first carved? It was new and fresh. But to think that over 1,000 years this has been in existence and is still in pure view. A lot of these were damaged in all of the battles and wars that happened in Ireland. And, that a lot of these were destroyed. So that's another reason why this is such an important place, because you can see one of these Celtic high crosses in a way that you really can't see anywhere else. I mean, even the crosses we have on Iona are not quite on this level with all of these images. This is Christ's crucifixion here. And St. Thomas is in here. This is St. Thomas here coming to see Christ, showing him his hands and his side. And this is an image of the base. Those are the cats there, you can see. And it's hard to see this, but this is the old Irish language, Celtic language being written in Gaelic, as we call it today, or Gaelga, as it's called in the Irish language. That's how we know it's Murdoch's cross. And we know Murdoch was an abbot, but there were two Murdochs, so we don't quite know if it was the 9th century, the 10th century. But anyway, this cross is over 1,000 years old. It still contains all these beautiful images of God. I took one of the hand of God. It's not as easy to see here, but the hand is underneath, and you have all these inner spiraled images of serpents, believe it or not, which you wouldn't think you'd see in Ireland. You'd think that would be in the Mayan temple somewhere, but it shows the carried on remembrance of the Celtic times, even before Christianity, which again will inspire people who are interested in Celtic spirituality later on. Another image here on the side of, and there are 3 high crosses at Monasterboice. So if you think one's not enough, there's also a tall cross near the round tower, and there's another one that's been damaged that has an old image of a sundial within it. So these were all important places, and they were the center of a whole community. And I'll show you what that looks like when we go to Glendalough. But another image that is very exquisite work with Celtic knotwork there on the side of something within 200-300 years of the Celtic Church really becoming the Roman Church more fully. The last place I want to show you from my own set of pilgrimages is the trip I had 3 or 4 years ago to Glendalough. Anybody been to Glendalough in Ireland? Another is important central part of early Irish and Celtic Christianity. Saint Kevin is another very important saint. That's whose prayer we offered this morning. Saint Kevin is one of those guys, just like the guys in Skellig Michael, going out to reach a green martyrdom, going out in the desert of Ireland, not into the deserts that we think of, but into the green deserts of Ireland. And the mountains, the Wicklow Mountains of Ireland would have been that sort of center. St. Kevin goes out, finds a lake, finds a cave, stays in Glendalough, and by the time he dies in 618, there's a whole community beginning to form around St. Kevin, and that will become the Glendalough community, which still is one of the greatest places where you can get a sense of early Christian practice and architecture in Ireland that still shows signs of the Celts as well. This is St. Kevin's Chapel, a church, which you can see right next to the round tower. And I realized when I was there, I took a picture in their museum, which I'm glad I did for all of us, to get a sense of what an early Irish monastic community looks like. So, of course, these are where the monks all live. And these are the community people who live outside. Usually there's still the old idea of a fort for protection, but the people are living here and are growing their own crops, and they are worshiping with the monks, and the monks are the center of the education of the community. And if you go to Glendalough, there's loads of old chapels. Some of them are still in existence and some are in ruin. But it shows how central all of this was. That was St. Kevin's Church there that I showed you a picture of. This is the big round tower. Another thing that's wonderful in Glendalough, because it's still standing. They're not always easy to find anymore because they date back 1,000 years generally. This was the image I had at the beginning of the class today, but you get a sense this is what you do when you find holy ground. You bury people on it, right? So it's huge cemeteries always surround all these remnants of monasteries. Audrey's mother is buried, and we were married right between, there's a wall between in the old Franciscan friary on Shirkin Island. We were married in the cloistered area, and her mother's buried on the other side of it because all the folks of Shirkin would like to be buried in this holy ground on the island, and it's near the Franciscan friary, which itself dates back to the 1300s. Another image where you can get a sense of the round tower, which is very important in Glendalough. And then I wish I could tell you I was on a hot air balloon and took that photo, but no, I just got it off of Wikipedia, right? But it's a beautiful image of the above ground look of Glendalough today. You think about how this whole area was surrounded by ancient medieval community of Christians in Ireland between, the 7th century onward. This is what's left of it, which includes medieval chapels, includes this one that's still in existence, and this wonderful round tower. These round towers that existed had lots of different purposes. Most likely there was a bell at the top to ring. I love bells. I love St. Thomas has a bell. Bells are the call to prayer, and they have been in the Christian tradition for centuries. If you go to the Holy Land, you can hear the Islamic call to prayer. That's your sense that prayer time has come. Bells, I believe, should ring every time we have a worship service to repeat this call to prayer for people out in the community and for people that are gathered to worship. The bell would have been up here. This was also a good place to keep your safe things because of those sneaky Vikings, right? I told you about those Vikings. They made it to Glendalough as well. They were troublemakers. And I love how this is the entrance door to the tower. 20 feet up is how high it was. This would allow the monks that if the sneaky Vikings got in, they could get into this tower, pull up the ladder, and at least lock the door and have the whole, sense of height to protect them until the Vikings brought their ladder and probably climbed up and got in. But the sense was this is about 20 feet up, and I love that you could see that door. I love that. Reminds me of Casadega, the spiritualist community in Florida. And if you go to Casadega, they have doors on the top part of the floors of their houses so the spirits can get in those doors. So these are not for spirits, these are for monks to get in and hopefully be protected. But it's a good view of walking here into what's now become a cemetery, but was the sacred ground of the Celtic monastic community. I had to have an image here of St. Kevin, who's the center of Glendalough. I don't know where this icon came from, but I'd like to have it. It's beautiful, with the round tower in the back. This looks a whole lot like the beehive huts, right? It's a sense of how the early monks, like Kevin, like the monks of Skellig Michael, like how they would have lived and built their communities. The difference between needing to build a beehive and St. Kevin is that St. Kevin was truly in the green forest of the Wicklow Mountains. He was completely surrounded by a jungle, I'm sure, at that time. And I love this image. Some images you see of St. Kevin, he'll have his hands out like this, and there'll be a raven or a bird on one hand. The story, one of the legends of St. Kevin, is that he went and stood in the lake, the big lake at Glendalough, in prayer, and he stayed there in prayer with his arms uplifted for so long to God that the birds built a nest in his hands. So St. Francis wasn't the first one to hang out with the animals. St. Kevin did that. So there's usually a bird in the icon, and this idea of building a nest, life in his hands. There's a wonderful Celtic cross that looks like the one we saw from Monaster Boyce there, and that's good old St. Kevin himself, who's given the credit as being the first monk and leader of the Glendalough community. And if you take a walk around the lake, you can get a sense of where Kevin lived. This is technically the cave where tradition tells us that St. Kevin lived and worshipped when he lived in Glendalough. And I love how they preserved the forest there. You get a little sense of what it might have even looked like if St. Kevin had been there. And what I want to finish up with now is how all of this comes together. The sense of Celtic Ireland, Celtic Britain, Celtics is a sense of the ancient peoples that many of us came from. I mean, if you're from the Church of England, that's why it would have been so important for them to make their arguments based on the Celtic Church. If you were W.B. Yeats and you were writing poetry inspired by the Irish people finding their language and becoming their own and shirking off those British who continued to invade, then that's why the Celtics were who you turned to. For us, as people who were colonizers of this land, that's our roots, right? And the ancients of those roots are the Celts. So that begins to create in the 19th century a sense of what Celtic Christianity really was like and what we envision it to be like. And one of the things that I think brings it all together, and hopefully some of you who've been on Celtic pilgrimages will agree with me, it is the wonderful amount of holy wells that exist all around Ireland. In the Republic of Ireland, they've counted over 2,600 holy wells where people continue to gather to dedicate those wells to saints, to offer prayers, to have a sense that there's healing within the waters of those wells. And of course, you don't have to think too hard to see where Christianity and folk traditions of the pagan past come together in the sense of these holy wells. And so I wanted to share with you, before I wrap up, some photos of holy wells I've visited. This is St. Kevin's Well in Glendalough. And it's a really nice one. There's steps to get down to it. It's quite a wide opening. And there's the natural influx of water that comes out of the ground. There's no question that before Christianity, this is where holy sites would have been for the pagan people, for the Druids, for those of ancient Celtic tradition. So it really is a place now where this has been named for a Christian saint and brings so many things we think about Celtic Christianity together. Brings together its Christian past, but it also has nature and the focus on the water coming up out of the ground being a sacred space. And there's always what they call rag trees or prayer trees nearby. This is the one in Glendalough in which people still wrap prayers, pieces of cloth to ask for something from the saints to help with people who are sick. And again, there's no question that this is a coming together of an ancient past and a Christian tradition that moves through the Celtic world and has been inspiring for a lot of people. This is St. Ciaran's Holy Well. This is on Cape Clear Island, which is the southernmost point of Ireland. Audrey and I see Cape Clear in the distance. And St. Ciaran is believed to have been born on Cape Clear Island. And this is the holy well dedicated to him. It's easy to find because you get it right when you get off the boat when you go to Cape Clear. And they have a wonderful image of St. Ciaran here in a full-on Celtic setup. St. Ciaran is another one of those early saints of Ireland. And then on the island where Audrey's from, if you go searching, every place, as I said, 2,600 something holy wells, that's a lot. And every place has one. This is an image walking up a hill on Shirkin Island. And if you go up there, you can find St. Mona's Well. And Audrey's not here to give me the correct Irish name for St. Mona, but the church on Shirkin is named after St. Mona. And there's a St. Mona's well. It's not nearly as put together as the other holy wells are, because you've got to walk through somebody's private backyard to get up the hill to get to it. But it's there, and there would have been worship services, and there would have been pilgrimages there by people who lived on Shirkin Island in the past. And just so you can maybe kind of see it, you have to dig in. I love that the primrose were in bloom when we made this trip up. Those are some of my favorite flowers on Shirkin Island, and they were in full bloom when we got there. But there is the well on the other side of it. And this would have been important. And last but not least, last year when I tried to go, remember I told you I tried to go to Skellig Michael when a rock fell and got shut down? Well, we decided we'd go to St. Brendan's Holy Well, which is on Valentia Island, which is right off the Dingle Peninsula, right there in County Kerry, off the Ring of Kerry, if you want to find it. And I loved it because we really had to go off the beaten path to find it. You had to go down a little one-lane road, which half the roads in Ireland are one lane anyway. This one had no pavement on it, though, so that was a serious road. We got to the end of it, we saw the sign, and we still had to walk all the way down the path and go over a fence or two to get to where St. Brendan the Navigator, another one of those early saints, often connected. I said St. Finian was connected with Skellig Michael. St. Brendan was another one who got out in those boats. And the story goes, and I'll show you, they even claim it in Ireland, that St. Brendan, you know, who wants to give those Vikings all the credit? The Irish think St. Brendan may have made it to North America first. And I'm with the Irish. Those Vikings, they don't need to get there. This is St. Brendan's Holy Well, which has a lot more look of a holy site for the Catholic tradition, but also our own tradition in Ireland. There's an altar over it here. And this is the way that you get down into the water. And of course, there are lots of stones that are left there, which are often a symbol of prayer. Again, you have Christians and non-Christians come, so if you go to these wells, somebody's going to drop a couple coins in them probably. Just the way we do what? Throw coins into fountains. It's something ancient that we still do. But this is St. Brendan the Navigator's well. And another image closer up so you can see the water down in there. It needs to be cleaned out a bit. Somebody cut the grass and blew it right in there. But anyway, it's way off. I don't know who owns the property for it, but St. Brendan's well is another holy well. And again, I feel like this is where the ancient Celtic past and the Celtic history of monasticism come together. This is one of the crosses off of there, a piece of stone that looks far more ancient than that wonderful Celtic cross we saw. There are two of these crosses near St. Brendan's well, and you know, I won't lie to you, that shot of Dingle Peninsula and the island, the water was beautiful out through there. Another one of the crosses, and you know, when you got a really cute daughter and she's praying, you can't help but be proud. So there's Eva, we crawled out there and she wanted to say a prayer by the holy stone there in Brendan's well. And this is something that was hanging up way out there near the main road. And this is the idea. St. Brendan, patron saint of Kerry. Again, here we are in the 5th and 6th century, that big period of time when Irish monasticism was growing. St. Brendan is also known as St. Brendan the Navigator, believed to have sailed as far as North America. Don't trust those Vikings. He was there first. Folklore says that he sailed across the Dingle Peninsula to Valentia Island, scaled the cliffs of Blue, and baptized 2 dying pagans at this well. The well with the stone cross is standing nearby is called the where's Audrey? She's not here. We'll just say, yeah, that one. The well of the oil of St. Brendan. I love this too. They want to catch all the tourists, so they're like, and Charles Lindbergh flew right over here. So, you know, the American-Irish connection is strong. They want us to know about this. And I don't know who James O'Leary was, but he lived beside the well and he waved at Charles Lindbergh. I love that. So a little bit of Blarney stuck in there for your trip there. The last couple of slides I have are of another images of that ancient Celtic past combining with Christianity. St. Bridget's Cross, we have one in the parlor that you can have a look at. These are made by reeds, and again, they really fit St. Bridget well because they tend to be the folk tradition and cross and Christianity and put the horseshoe over your house to protect it, all wound up together. And then the last couple shots are of Mokras Abbey, another one of those Franciscan friaries built around 1,000 years ago. But within it, in the cloistered area, is this gorgeous yew tree. It's really the center of the whole thing. To see that yew tree is spectacular. And I'll leave it, I'm obviously running out of time, but if you go to the National Museum in Dublin, you can see really one of the great pieces of Celtic Christianity that's been preserved, and that is St. Patrick's Bell, which really looks like it probably would have looked if it is from the 6th century, which is really later than Patrick. But it was, again, what did I say, is rung to call you to prayer. St. Patrick would have rang this bell. It probably sounded like a cowbell, but it would have been what needed to be called together. And this gorgeous Celtic artwork that's been put together as the shrine for St. Patrick's Bell, which is in Armagh, the north of Ireland. But you can see that beautiful Celtic needlework. So it's just the sense of that wonderful design of Celtic tradition, Celtic myth, Celtic history, all coming together. And as usual, I don't have a whole lot of time, but anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Real quick one.
Yeah.
These wells, they were a source of water, but were they also like holy water?
Yeah, those wells they would have had other ways to get natural water. They would have had the more traditional wells. And even in Ireland today, if you go where Audrey's from on Sherkin Island, you can find the old pump well that would have pumped the water up for the people to get for their livelihood. These holy sites would have been natural areas where the water collected that would have been centered off as a place of the holy place. And again, if you think again about the Celtic people were very similar to the way all native people were. They would have lived within the world, within the earth, within the environment. They would have dealt with wind and air and fire and water and earth. That would have been very important. So, of course, they would have had memories of the pre-Christian past in which those holy wells would have been holy places. And they would have transformed them into a saint's well and used the same practice of collecting water for healing. I mean, this still survives in the Catholic Church, although, I mean, if you have Catholic friends, if anybody goes to Lourdes, they'll have some water from the grotto of Lourdes, right? I mean, that's holy water for them. So this tradition is an ancient tradition that dates back a long way. And so it would not have been where they would have collected the water for their animals and for their livelihood. This would have been set off as a place of holiness, and it still is today. Yes, Sally?
One of the tours I took visited St. Bridget's wells.
Yeah.
And most of them had some type of dipper.
So you could collect the water.
And
yeah.
wash yourself or whatever. And if one of them, farther to the west and north, we had to leave because there was a family group coming in to do a ritual that we couldn't figure out what it was all about. But
yeah.
they let us know that we were just tourists and we weren't welcome.
That's right.
This was their holy place.
That's right.
For their ritual they were about to do.
All the ones I went to are more like the ones I showed you, that unless it was scheduled, like St. Thomas going on Green Mountain, then they were open to the public at all time. But the Catholic Church does have control over a few of the wells and have really set up chapels in relation to them, and they would be scheduled probably for healing services. I mean, honestly, the sense of the holiness of the water of the wells still carries over, and to get the priest to anoint you with holy oil is one thing. If you can get into St. Bridget's well and have St. Bridget intercede for you, you have a better chance. So more than likely, and some of those are much more easier to get to, and the church runs in that format, versus the ones you really have to get out and hike to find, which are the ones out there. Yeah, and a lot of them, again, holy ground, you're going to get buried. People are going to be buried on it. It would have been the tradition in the church. I always tell people, I've done only one 1928 prayer book funeral. And those of you who might remember a funeral from that funeral was written in the 1928 prayer book with the idea that the cemetery is outside the church you're doing the funeral in. That's why it doesn't work well anymore, because most of our cemeteries are no longer, unless we got a columbarium like we have here, most cemeteries are no longer built around the churches anymore. But in those times it would have been, and that's why every ancient holy spot in Ireland has a cemetery around it, generally. Any other? Yes, Linda Lou.
I just stand up because of my voice being carried. Back to the original cross that you showed us.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the weighing of the bodies or the souls.
Yeah.
Or, do you have any more specifics about that? Were they were serious about that, right?
Yeah, they were. I mean, it goes back to that story in Matthew's Gospel in which Jesus talks about the sheep and the goats, right? The sheep would have acknowledged who Jesus was, and the sheep are welcomed in, and the goats did not recognize who Jesus was and are sent to hell. The idea of St. Michael is that he's the archangel, he's the chief angel in charge. So in the Middle Age, remember these are medieval period of time, they would have seen the weighing of souls. That would have been an image of judgment. So that last judgment is that whole scene. And the last judgment is what we still call the four end times. There's death and there's death and there's, I've forgotten it now, sorry. Anyway, the heaven and hell is what I'm getting at. And so that last judgment scene would have been important to project out to the people who were reading it. And the St. Michael image is just the image of who's in charge. You know, St. Michael's always, well, the images of St. Michael we have, the icons always have St. Michael doing what? Stepping on the head of the devil with a good spear or a sword in his hand. So that's why he's the one. He's the military guy, right? So if you're in judgment and you're found guilty, the police officer comes and escorts you out. We still do that. So St. Michael's the police officer in that. And it would have been in the tradition of the church, that would have been his role as the archangel. So, fun stuff. Yes?
Could the Egyptian influence?
Yeah, there would have definitely been, we know that the Egyptian monastic practices would have influenced the Celtic monks, but Egyptian religion would have had less to do because by this time, by the time Christianity comes around, that the ancient Egyptian religious practices are not quite as in vogue as they would have been at the time of the pharaohs, right? You just asked me a question. I just answered something like I knew what I was talking about. I really don't know. I would say that there's always the influence of other religions. You know, I've got a class that I'll do maybe in Advent about angels, and we understand that the way we see angels had a whole lot to do with the way the Assyrians imagined angelic forces and godly images. So, what was the Egyptian impact on the Celts? Would have been what was the Egyptian influence on the early church and as it was developing, and that would have got transferred into the Celtic world. So the answer could be yes, could have been, yeah. It's a good. And the cats, yeah, I mean, they would have, but these cats are down on the lower level. I think again, I love another story is the story of Julian of Norwich. She's not a saint. But the only thing she was allowed to have in her cell was a cat. Not necessarily because cats were worshipped, but because they kept vermin away. So I don't know if it would have been that same image the Egyptians had of cats. Those who like cats would like that. Yeah. I've got to wrap up, but yeah. What do you think? I got loads of blarney to offer. So yes, I have. The last image I'll leave you with is Saint Aoife of Shirkin. Thank you all. And be on the lookout. We'll have more class information coming out next week for what we're doing this fall.